So, welcome to this October's Halloween-themed Enlightening lunch. Well, not really, but we have invited the scariest faculty member that we have now. Perhaps the least scariest faculty member that we have, Ray Ostman, to talk to you today about a variety of public engagement things. There's no title on her slide, so I can't even tell you what she thinks her title is. But I guess we at CSPO and SFIS have been working with Ray for a long time. Before she joined our faculty, she had been a principal in the Nanoscale Informal Science Education Network, which was a large NSF-funded project that was sort of the public engagement informal science ed side of what the National Science Foundation was doing around nano, and they were funded at precisely the same time that the Center for Nanotechnology and Society at ASU that we ran here was funded. And I think, Ira was there when we were reading the press release, and we saw there we were, and there Santa Barbara Nano Center was. It was like, informal science ed? What? What's going on here? And they were spending 3 or 4 times the amount of money on that they were spending on it. But we were really intrigued from the very beginning about what the NISENet was going to do, and they were generous enough to welcome us to some of their early meetings. And very early on in the relationship between both organizations, a partnership developed, and we began to plan for the long term. And wouldn't you know it, we are now living at the beginning of the long term. At this point, some 13 years passed since the first time I went to San Francisco and met the folks from NISENet. And Ray is now the director of the Nanoscale Informal Science Education Network's follow-on, the National Informal Science Education Network, and along with Paul Martin, she co-directs the Center for Innovation in Informal STEM Learning here at SFIS and Institute for Futurization Society. So without any more ado, Ray Ostman, and whatever, I don't know whether there's Halloween in there or not.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. Happy to talk to you. So what I'll go through today is I'll just give a quick grounding in what informal learning is, our informal STEM education, in case you're all wondering, like 13 years ago Dave was, what is this? Give a quick overview of what Paul and I are doing with our center, and then very quickly describe what NISENet is and how the center and NISENet continue to work together. And then I chose to focus on 2 projects, one Frankenstein, because it's very timely, and then a second project on chemistry. And I chose these because there's a lot of overlap both in the approach, the public engagement approach that they take, and in the kinds of research that we're doing as part of these 2 projects. So they fit together nicely. And then I hope we'll have a lot of time for discussion. So informal STEM learning is really the learning that happens outside of school throughout people's lives. And so we often describe learning that happens inside of school as formal education or higher education, and the learning that happens outside of school is informal learning. So informal STEM education supports lifelong learning for multiple and diverse audiences, so people of all backgrounds throughout their lives. And one way that we think about how this works, how this is a system of education, is by thinking about it as a learning ecosystem. And so in an ecosystem, the learners are at the center. So rather than thinking about ourselves and the institutions the way I just described it, we actually think about the learners and what their experience of learning is. And then there's a whole variety of community organizations that coordinate and create pathways among different learning experiences, ideally, that help people find their way through their interests and learn in all sorts of different settings. And the goal of a learning ecosystem is to really connect and extend and reinforce the learning that happens in all different settings throughout people's lives. And then I just wanted to share some of the goals that we might have, or the kind of the learning outcomes that people might take away from participating in informal STEM learning experiences. And this comes from National Research Council, one of their consensus reports called Learning Science in Informal Environments. And this was the follow-up from a similar report that really looked at the kinds of STEM learning that happened in school. They followed that up with STEM learning that happened outside of school, and they created a combined framework. And so these 6 pieces are the kinds of STEM learning that is sort of validated from the research literature that happen both in school and out of school. And informal STEM learning can support all 6 of these, and they're sort of grouped into a few different bigger buckets. So exploring the findings of science and the phenomena, engaging in the process of science, and then participating in the scientific community. Informal STEM can support all of those, but it's particularly good at this first one and this last one. And so if you think about how learning outside of school and inside of school are complementary, one of the sort of unique or things that we're particularly strong at doing in informal learning contexts are sort of this motivation and excitement about learning STEM, and then developing an identity as somebody who does learn and think about STEM. We can do the other things, but if you think about really learning the scientific domain or really learning the scientific process, that can in some ways be better done in a school setting. But this sort of excitement and identity, it turns out, is actually done really well outside of school throughout people's lives. By connecting it to the whole rest of their lives, that's where they develop their STEM identity. And then another sort of key framework that we use in informal STEM learning is thinking about general 21st century skills that help people to succeed, and thinking about how we can help support those. And some in particular that I'll just be talking about today are what are called learning and innovation skills. And so that's critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, innovation, the kinds of things that we're really trying to do here at SFIS. So we have Paul Martin. I'm co-director of the Center for Innovation and Informal STEM Learning. And what we're really doing is investigating how people learn STEM throughout their lives. And we do this through a whole variety of research and development projects. One of the things that we're particularly focused on right now, building as a program as part of SFIS, is bringing people together to understand our world today and think about how to shape the future that we all want to live in. And part of that work is creating opportunities to think critically about and create new visions for STEM in society. How does the STEM enterprise and society kind of work together, and how do they shape each other, and where are we trying to take that in the future? And then the particular way that we're going about that is really thinking about research, practice, and education partnerships. And what I mean by that is a little bit different from sort of research to practice, where perhaps the research happens here, there are some findings, and we're trying to sort of push them off to practitioners and hope they implement them. In this case, we're trying to integrate the research and the practice from the very beginning. So we're investigating questions that both researchers and practitioners care about, and we're contributing equally to sort of answering those questions and finding those interventions. And then here at ASU, we have the opportunity to integrate education in that as well. And so that means involving students and others in also being part of that work, and so developing kind of the next generation of informal STEM educators. And then ideally, that all results in kind of really contributing to societal transformations at scale through national partnerships. And this is where the NISE network comes in that Dave was describing. NISE network is now, as Dave mentioned, is known as the National Informal STEM Education Network. We have hundreds of organizations that participate in the network. So just this past year, or 2018, so the year that's coming to a close, we had about 400 institutions that sort of received products for us, did activities, sent us reports. We're super active in this year. And if you look back in our past history, there's hundreds more. So we have hundreds and hundreds of organizations that participate, and thousands of educators that are at all of those organizations. And some of the organizations are museums, about 2/3 of them, and particularly hands-on science museums and children's museums, and then about 1/3 are universities. And at universities, some of our partners are STEM researchers. Some of them are outreach coordinators and folks that are doing kind of similar informal education work as part of their role. And together, all of the hundreds of organizations of the network reach millions of people each year. So we have a small footprint exhibition that we worked on really closely with CNS ASU that we developed as part of the NANO project. And just that one exhibition continues to reach 10 million people per year. And we've got additional projects and all sorts of other things that add on to that. So it's really over 10 million people a year that we're able to reach through NISENet. And so that's a really important way for us to take whatever innovations, whatever ideas we develop as part of the center. Some of those are appropriate for scaling and can be kind of scaled up and implemented in a really large way across the US. So now I'll tell you about 2 current projects. And what I'm going to do, appropriately, is a little bit of a Frankenstein presentation of these two projects. I'm going to focus more on the development side of the Frankenstein project, so the sort of the creation of the content, the creation of the public engagement activities for that project. I'm going to switch over to the chemistry project, and I'll talk a little bit more about the research in that one, partly because there's some redundancy and partly just because of the role of my project, and my role on the project, and then sort of what's most interesting about the two of them. So Frankenstein 200 is a project led by Ed Finn here at ASU. He's a principal investigator, and it's part of the big extravaganza of things that ASU is doing to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And this project is engaging public audiences in exploring themes of creativity and responsible innovation, really inspired by the novel by Mary Shelley's work. And the project itself is a transmedia project, which means that we've created opportunities for people to learn across different media, and then we're studying how what kind of learning happens within each of them, but also happens as a result of participating in more than one of these products. And the two primary things that we're looking at are some hands-on museum programs, and I'll talk about those primarily because I was most closely involved with those, but also an alternate reality game that takes place online. So the learning objectives, the public learning objectives for this project are to help learners practice 21st century skills, so creativity, collaboration, some of the ones I mentioned earlier, to explore emerging technologies, and we chose to focus in this project on one hand, artificial intelligence, robotics, and on the other hand, the sort of area of synthetic biology, human enhancement, genetic engineering. So those are the sort of two broad areas that we focused on. And then to provide opportunities for learners to reflect on responsible innovation by embedding questions as part of the experience. And so really having the facilitators helping them to reflect on responsible innovation as they were taking on the role of being a creator themselves. And if you've read the novel, you know that that's where Victor Frankenstein fell down a little bit. Focus more on the creation and less on the reflecting about responsible innovation. And so that's the piece that we're really trying to emphasize and pick up in this project. And there are three key questions that we're sort of posing to public audiences as they participate in this project. And Ruth Wiley's not here. I'm sorry about that. She's in Tulsa doing research right now. But the way she puts it is these are questions that are easy to understand but hard to answer. And what's important about that is that means that because we're dealing with really broad public audiences, some are children, some are adults, they've got all sorts of different levels of kind of experience and engagement with STEM. Questions that are easy for everyone to understand but have sort of infinite difficulty of answering are perfect, because wherever you are, you have something to kind of think about or contribute to these questions. And the three questions are: what is life? Why do we create as human beings? Why do we create? And then what are our responsibilities as creators, scientists, and engineers? And so the piece of the project that I was most involved with was developing activities that are being implemented now in 50 museums across the US. And this was a kit of hands-on activities, and there were sort of two categories of activities that we created. One were making and tinkering activities that really focused on that creativity and responsible innovation piece. And again, in those two domains of STEM research that I mentioned. And then a second set were more hands-on science activities, and they investigated some of the science of Mary Shelley's time to provide some grounding of what kind of research was happening at the time that Mary Shelley wrote her novel, and how did that lead her to sort of have some of these questions. So this is what the sort of final kit looked like in a really literal sense. So it was a box of activities that was sent out to 50 museums. And the idea with these is they're really ready to use. You can sort of literally open up the box, learn the activities, and implement them in a way that will be successful. And this is important to us because we want these to go to really diverse organizations. We want them to go to really small institutions in rural places that may not have any kind of a STEM expert on staff. They might be a tiny children's museum and they focus more on play, or it may go to a really large museum where there's people who do nothing but research on informal STEM learning all day long, and the kids have to work equally well and be successful for the public participants in both contexts. I'm going to run through just the activities that are in there. Try not to dwell too much, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that people are doing. I'll start with the ones that focus on kind of the science of Mary Shelley's time. There is one activity that we call battery stack that's really reproducing a voltaic pile, right? So the first original battery They'll learn how they work and make one. And then have a conversation about how was this new discovery of electricity being used in Mary Shelley's time? And then thinking about battery, which are really pervasive in our society today, can be used for good things and can be used for bad things. And is it the invention itself that's good or bad, or is it the way that we use it? Second activity is Spark of Life. And this activity lets people experiment with how electricity can interact with their own body, their human body. So there's a couple different activities. There's an activity that lets you use a TENS unit. I don't know if you know those that will actually contract your muscles by putting electricity through them. And there's one where you can just, it's called a hand battery, where you can just use your own body to complete an electrical circuit and conduct electricity. So just to understand how your body interacts with electricity. And this one, it really directly relates to some of the research that was happening in Mary Shelley's time about her thinking about, could you reanimate a dead human body? Another activity called Dough Creature, you may know as squishy circuits. It's using conductive Play-Doh to, again, complete an electrical circuit. So you can make your own little mushy creature like this, and then you can bring it to life by using a battery pack and LEDs or little motors and all sorts of things. And the connections, the sort of scientific connections for this one, we're really looking at things like artificial meat that's being grown in a lab, or each activity also had a kind of a pop culture connection, so connecting in some way to all the different ways that we know and retell the Frankenstein story today. An activity called Monster Mask is very appropriate. I should have brought one of my masks to wear today. This is a super simple activity where participants just make a mask, which, depending on their age, they can, again, use electrical tape and little LEDs and kind of put some bling on it and bring it to life, or it can just be a simple mask. And this activity is so simple, but actually leads to surprisingly rich conversations with kids of all ages, and thinking about how your appearance, how it really communicates to people what kind of person you are, and how we make judgments about people based on what they look like, which is something that the monster, the creature, struggled with in Mary Shelley's story. And so really thinking about that has led to a lot of great conversations with visitors. And then we looked at synthetic biology as one of the scientific connections for this activity. Frankentoy is another really simple activity, but that's been fun. We took a lot of different stuffed animals and took them apart and put magnets on them, and you can reconfigure them in all different ways. And the question here is sort of what happens in genetic engineering, or some of these areas of current research where we're combining DNA from different animals, and how do we feel about that, or different plants and animals. And the connection, to this story is around obviously the creation of the monster, but also does he deserve to have somebody to live with? And then we use the woolly mammoth, the potential to de-extinct the woolly mammoth is kind of an interesting question for people to think about, whether we might do that and what might happen if we were to do that. Another activity called Automata is just creating a small mechanical machine that you can turn the crank and move in different ways. There's different cams. You can make all sorts of different motions. You can get, this is one of those ones you can do very simple motion, or you can get quite elaborate with it. And is starting to think about the difference between people and machines. So that what is life question. And as we develop increasingly intelligent machines, does that distinction start to blur? And then finally, Dave's favorite activity in the kit is the scribble bot. And this is this particular, the version that we put together is used. It has a pool noodle and an offset motor, and then its little legs are markers. And so when you turn the battery, in this case it's actually a toothbrush, electric toothbrush, when you turn it on, it sort of appears to come to life and scribbles, and then you can have all sorts of interesting conversations with kids about whether the inventor of the technology, you made the scribble bot, now it's scribbled on an important paper of your mom's, who's responsible, the scribble bot itself or you as the inventor, right? Like, where does that responsibility lie? Or say that this piece of art is now worth $1 million, who should get that? So people will sometimes have shifting ideas of who's responsible depending on whether the outcome is positive or negative. And so it's been a really effective way to start to think about the implications of our work as creators and the inventions. And then the second major public engagement product that came out of this project is an alternate reality game, and this retells Mary Shelley's story in an immersive, active online environment. And in this retelling of the story, it's a laboratory called the Laboratory for Innovation in Fantastical Exploration, or LIFE, that was founded by Dr. Victoria Frankenstein, and so she's a descendant of the original Victor Frankenstein in the fictional story. And she has two research assistants that are really kind of the heroes or the protagonists of the story, and you kind of experience it through their eyes. One is Maya, and she focuses on genetics and biochemistry, and the other is Xavier, and he focuses on machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I don't really want to spoil it if you haven't played it, but the twist is that one of these two ends up being a creature herself that was created by Tori Frankenstein. So Tori has not learned from the lessons of her ancestor in this particular case. And the way that we've been one of the ways, there's many ways, but one of the ways we've been working to connect learners between these two environments, the transmedia piece of the project, is by recruiting people at museum events to then go and play the online game when they go home. Some people may discover the online game and then maybe they can get to a museum. It's pretty loose and flexible. We made the two experiences so that you absolutely can participate in just one, and that's a complete experience on its own. But if you're able to participate in two, then you get a a greater variety of the kinds of things you're doing, and obviously a longer duration of participation. So the research is kind of looking at what happens with that. I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about chemistry now. So this project is led by the Museum of Science in Boston, and Larry Bell is the PI. And it is a design-based research project that's studying strategies to increase positive attitudes towards learning chemistry. And the learning piece is key. We're not necessarily trying to increase positive attitudes towards chemistry as an endeavor, but towards learning chemistry. And this is, I mentioned that because one of our major partners in this project is ACS, American Chemical Society. And so they're providing a lot of expertise and other resources, but it's primarily a research on learning project. It's not a chemistry PR project. And the three positive attitudes that we're looking to support in learners who participate in this project are interest, so a sense of interest in chemistry that they can sort of develop at a museum, but then carry through their life and continue learning. A sense of an understanding of the relevance of chemistry and how it connects to their everyday life, other things they may know about or be learning about, and then self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is this sense that you are someone who can learn chemistry, talk about chemistry, think about chemistry. And so it's just having the attitude that you can be a learner. This project started with a theoretical framework, and that framework is being kind of revised and iterated throughout the project, and so that's the design-based research part. That's the part where both the researchers and the practitioners have a stake in the research questions. And what we're looking at is what are the facilitation strategies? So what do I do as an educator? And then what are the design strategies? How is the activity itself designed that support this kind of learning? And then in particular, this is hands-on chemistry activities that are being delivered in museums. So as the framework, these are sort of generalizable findings, and so the framework findings may be applicable to other domains of science, so you might be able to take these from chemistry and apply them to physics, or you might be able to take them from the informal learning setting and apply them to the formal setting, but we specifically studied them in a certain context, and that's kind of a key piece of design-based research is it's sort of grounded in a particular place. It doesn't happen outside of a real-life context, sort of in a lab in a highly controlled environment. It happens in the real world, which is in this case in the museum. So the process that we've been going through, we started with a preliminary framework, and that was done through front-end research, looking at previous work we've done in NISNet, as well as previous work across educational literature, and then we've been testing that as we've been working through the project. And so we started just by prototyping activities that seemed like they aligned with the framework or they were interesting to us in some way. We thought they had a connection. The ones that seemed promising as a result of that early prototyping moved on. The ones that weren't promising, we set them aside. And then this subset of promising activities, we did testing and data collection with visitors in the museums. And there's a whole variety of different kinds of data that we collected, so there's a lot to sift through. We have observations, we have videotaping, we have surveys from visitors, and then interviews with visitors, so all different kinds of information. And we're working on studying these interactions with the educator or the facilitator, the visitor, the participants, and the activities themselves, thinking about all three of these really working together, defining the activity, what the facilitator is doing, and what the learner brings to the table and is doing as their part of it. And then the researchers and the educators, the activity developers, talk through the data, talk through the experience, talk through the data, think about how to improve the interventions, think about how to interpret the data. And that's key because it's not that the developers are off thinking about how to improve the activities and the researchers are off thinking about what the data means. The conversations are happening together. Obviously everybody has their own role and expertise, but the kind of decisions move forward together in this project. And that we improve the activities and test them again. So each activity is tested and data is collected 2 or 3 times. And then we did 3 different rounds of activity development and testing so that what we learned from this first round of maybe 5 activities, we could apply to a whole new round of different activities, see what still held, what new came out. So it's been a long and elaborate process. And I'm just going to share some high-level findings. To date, we don't have our final findings, but I'll share some things we've learned so far. The first thing is with the facilitation strategies. It's not especially surprising, but what we found is that they support engagement and learning generally rather than specifically. And what that means is there's not a strategy that's going to lead to cat developing interest. It's sort of, there's a strategy that supports it being a positive learning experience in general. And then there are design strategies, and those are more specific. And so there are strategies that you can use that specifically would lead to interest, that specifically lead to relevance, or specifically lead to self-efficacy. So they're a little bit more specific than the strategies that support the facilitation strategies. And again, at a very high level, what we found is that to encourage interest in learning chemistry, then the content of the activity, and then the format or the structure, the way it's designed are really important. To illustrate the relevance of chemistry, then the content is really key, and the kind of conversations you have around the content are key. And then to help learners develop feelings of self-efficacy, again, the format and the structure are particularly important. I'll walk through these and I'll give one activity as an example. So the facilitation strategies sort of fall into 3 general categories. One is inviting participation. And so that's sort of like welcoming people in, inviting them to be part of the activity, maybe modeling what we're going to do here today, working to engage the entire group. People typically attend museums and social groups, and so it's important to engage the entire group in social learning. And then supporting exploration. And so one key thing here is really quickly to turn over the control of the activity to the participants. You know, get them started, but then let them really do it. And then the role of facilitator at this stage is sort of being attentive, asking questions that might help to guide them, really listening, supporting them through challenges when they need it, offering positive feedback, but really stepping back. You know, somebody else is leading now. And then a third kind of key piece of this is deepening understanding. So asking questions that can prompt reflection, discussion, help them build on what they're doing and connect it to other things that they know. And all of that helps lead to interest, relevance, and self-efficacy. And this is presented here in a really linear way, and to a certain degree it does happen in sequence, but in reality it's a lot messier than that. And people and the facilitators will move back and forth across all of these depending, they will be very flexible and responsive, and they'll move back and forth across these 3 different categories of facilitation techniques throughout the interaction. One super high level finding, but I thought I would share with you, is of the interactions that are most successful, meaning that the people who participate report that the outcomes of the activity are most closely aligned to the outcomes we wanted to see. They can have all sorts of positive or negative outcomes, but in the ones that are most successful in the terms of the goals of the project, this is about the distribution of how facilitators are spending their time. So they're spending about 2/3 of their time really supporting the learners in doing it themselves, and they're only spending 1/3 of the time kind of setting it up, sharing what they know, and kind of guiding. And I think, you know, really experienced informal educators, this isn't surprising at all. But in this particular project, we have a lot of chemistry students are coming in as volunteers, And they've got a lot to share, and one of the big learning points for them is, like, you don't need to share everything you know about chemistry, right? Just a little bit is what you need to share, and just the right thing at the right time. And likewise, if somebody's having a little bit of struggle doing something, like, struggle can be productive. Don't immediately take over and sort of show the right way to do it. And so there's some really basic but important learnings for becoming new facilitators out of this kind of research. And then the design techniques. I mentioned we really looked at two aspects of the design. One was the chemistry content, and then the other was the activity format and structure, the way it was developed or designed. And these there's quite a bit of overlap, you'll see, but they do lead to kind of more distinct outcomes as we sort of sifted through what strategies we saw in each activities and which outcomes we saw from testing these with visitors. So I'm just going to share, I'm just going to talk about relevance in particular and talk about some of the design strategies that support relevance. So that's one of the three learning outcomes that we're looking for in this project. In terms of content, the chemistry content, the strategies that best support relevance outcomes are connecting to people's everyday life. So that sort of is the definition of relevance, so it's not surprising. But talking about the applications and uses of chemistry, chemistry concepts just more generally, connections across other STEM topics is key. Some people haven't yet studied chemistry or don't yet think about STEM as being sort of these separate disciplines, and so making broad connections can really help people understand both what chemistry is and why it's relevant. And then finally, connections to societal issues is, again, really important to establishing why chemistry is relevant. And that can be a positive or a negative connection that they make. You know, they can draw their own conclusions about that. In terms of the format and structure, we found that familiar experiences was really key, and this is kind of an interesting one. So, for example, one of the things that we looked at is it better to use familiar equipment, the kinds of stuff you might have in your kitchen, or is it better to use more lab-looking equipment, right? Where are you trying to make the connection? And in terms of relevance, the familiar equipment that you might use in your kitchen establishes a lot more relevance than sort of unfamiliar equipment that belongs in a lab that maybe you saw, you know, back in your high school chemistry class where you haven't even really seen yet as a child. Use of tools and materials actually really helps to establish relevance. And that's a big overlap with self-efficacy there, and then observing phenomena. And so I think that with that one, it's that you're directly observing it, and so you're making sort of a personal connection in your own experience. Oh, I should just mention, the particular activity, to illustrate this, is one that's called What's in the Water. And this activity provides a few different ways to analyze water, and then talks about why we test water in everyday life. Why do we test the water in a pool? Why do we test the water in a fish tank? Why do we test the water in the public water supply? And lots of sites are able to go and collect water, say out of a river or out of a lake that's nearby, or out of a fish tank if they have a fish tank in the museum, and provide that for testing. But we also have just recipes to create water that has different characteristics that people can test. So this boy is looking in a refractometer. So what's happening right now is that it is National Chemistry Week, yay, in October. So these activity kits are at 250 sites across the U.S. They primarily went to museums, but some ACS groups also received them. But regardless of who received the actual box, we're encouraging collaborations between the museums and the local ACS sections or student sections, or kind of whatever exists locally. We're collecting data, more data. We don't have enough data. And these data are on how people use the kit resources, who participated, so in terms of museum staff or museum volunteers or ACS volunteers, other community volunteers, who participated in terms of members of the public who came to the event. And then what were the learning outcomes for both the facilitators and for the members of the public. And those are being collected through 2 different online reports, and then also we have some members of our research and evaluation staff who are collecting on site with observations and surveys. And we'll be using these additional data, again, to continue to refine the theoretical framework. We're also doing a summative evaluation. Even though this is a design-based research project at its core, it's also an NSF-funded project, and so we're creating a summative evaluation report that kind of reports on the public impact and how that aligns to the learning outcomes. And then just generally kind of responsibility to NSF. Like, we shipped off all these kits, it cost a lot of money, people did use them in National Chemistry Week. Some of that kind of basic accountability. And that's all I have prepared. I'm happy to have some discussion.
I'll break the ice for you. My name is Jason. I'm a PhD student. I have two questions. One of them is for the Frankenstein 201, and the other one is about your facilitation strategies in chemistry.
Okay.
So the first one is I saw this icon in the kit. That icon is the lab coat. What does that say about who's a scientist, about who has power and who has responsibility? What does that teach the children? Because we know that there are scientists who don't wear lab coats.
Yeah, for sure. And we talked about the lab coat. I'll just preface this by saying that anyone who receives the kit can choose to use or not use the lab coats. And there were two sizes of lab coats that were in the kit. One is an adult size that if people choose, they can have facilitators wear them. And then there's also child-size lab coats. So again, if the sites choose, they can let kids dress up in the lab coat. We talked a lot about this. Part of the reason for including the lab coat is that some of the research that we're doing on self-efficacy connects to some of the research about when you draw, we ask kids to draw a picture of a scientist, who do they draw? And so the lab, like you said, it's really iconic to draw the lab coat but like the sort of who the person is in the lab coat tends to be really stereotypical. And so one of the questions is by letting a kid put on the lab coat themselves, or seeing really diverse facilitators wearing that lab coat, can you kind of expand people's idea of who wears the lab coat and what they do? But I don't at all disagree that not all scientists wear lab coats and that there's a little bit, some people have been, not people that have been implementing the activities, but I've also gotten some pushback about kind of connecting science to the stigma of Frankenstein and kind of connecting the science that's happening today with this story, and is that sort of an unfair framing? But my idea is things are complicated and people are smart, and I'm not trying to sort of hide complex ideas from people. I want them to really explore them, and I want to put them out there for people to explore. So that's the lab coat question, and then can you repeat the facilitation?
Thank you. So the facilitation question is, and it may be partly answered with your lack of data. You have facilitation strategies that you walked across with different percentages of where where you're finding the most emphasis. So what kind of students were in those results? Are those normal learning type students? Are you making modifications in your facilitation strategies for students who have different learning requirements, whether it's autism or physical disabilities or something like that? Is that accounted for?
Yeah, so the data those particular data were collected, as I said, sort of on the museum floor with general public audiences. So it wasn't controlled in the sense that we didn't recruit for people with certain characteristics, but we collect enough data so that we have a certain sample. If we didn't get any people of differing abilities, we would continue collecting data until we got those. But there are certain limitations. It's never perfect. It's not totally representative. But we do try to get kind of a diverse sample. In terms, it's a little bit messier than, don't really start out with, okay, here's a visiting group, and I found out everything demographically about them, and here are the strategies I'm going to use. It's messier than that. It's more naturalistic. And so how it works is that we're actually looking back at the data after the fact. And so if this is my visiting group, they come up, I facilitate the activity. I certainly do it differently than I did with this group over here, just because of who they are and what questions they ask and kind of what comes up. What we're trying to do after the fact is kind of sort out what were the strategies that the facilitators used in this instance, what were the outcomes we saw, and what connections can we draw. And so in many cases, correlation, right? It's not causation data. So we tend to notice these facilitation strategies, we tend to notice these outcomes, and then we're trying to make sense of those. One of the things that sort of really puzzled the researchers at first is a little bit less puzzling to me, is that in some cases you'll see a lot more of certain facilitation techniques with groups like, say, interest. With groups that express less interest in the end, you'll see them using more facilitation strategies related to building interest. And they were like, well, that doesn't make sense. They were using all these strategies to encourage interest. Why is this group less interesting? And I was like, I think it's the other way around. This group was less interested, so the facilitator responded by using more strategies to try to build that up. And so we don't have the kind of data, it's not really like a super controlled data set. Did that answer?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks.
Are you finding though that those interventions are correlating towards different learning styles, learning abilities?
I don't think we've dug that deeply into the data. So what we've done at this point is the researchers have, what kind of works is they go off, they sort of sift through and find some preliminary patterns, they come back and they talk with those of us who are more on the content development or facilitation side, and we sort of talk through it, and then that gives them some more ideas of what they might look at next. And so one of the pieces that they'll look at next are sort of particular demographic data. And in some pieces, we collect quite a bit of demographic data for each group, but people can choose to reply or not reply to. So that's a piece. But we do have, but back to children with autism in particular, just as an example. If we were to see some kind of indication or kind of preliminary thing that this was an interesting question, but we didn't have enough data, then we can go and we could ask a museum partner that has like a sensory day, right? That is particularly designed for those participants, and we could collect some more data that was a little bit sharper, kind of in terms of who the audience is, and then we can look more, and we might even ask them to facilitate the activity in a certain way because we wanted to answer that question. So that's the nice thing about doing it in these rounds that I mentioned, is when we get something that's like, that's kind of interesting, let's try that next time, then sometimes we get kind of a more sharp pattern the next time around.
For public outreach, and engagement type activities and programs, a lot of times with the expectation that the participants are going to learn X, Y, and Z content, or it's going to have some sort of big shift in either their belief or they're going to become scientists themselves. I was wondering your thoughts on those kinds of expectations, or what expectations you all have for your program.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. So different projects really have different learning objectives for the learners, and so for the Nano project that Dave was describing, we had a lot more content-based learning objectives. Like there were specific things about nanotechnology that we wanted people to learn, and so in that one we were looking at a lot more awareness and understanding. Are they more aware of nanotechnologies? Do they more understand what makes nanoscale science different from regular science? And so that particular one we had really different questions that we were looking at. And so that's in terms of the kind of learning. And then there's this bigger kind of outcome that you were mentioning, which is to what end, right? For what purpose are you doing this? Yes, and in some cases it is to try to encourage people to study STEM, and there are lots of projects that do that, or that are trying, to increase general scientific literacy. There's all sorts of different outcomes. These two really focus a lot more on kind of skills and attitudes, with the idea that you could do this with chemistry, but you could also do this with physics. If you're trying to give people a sense of self-efficacy about learning, chemistry is a great place to do it, but maybe something else would be good too. And my own thought is that in a museum setting, trying to teach people all about chemistry is probably not the best use of time, because you just, you don't have that length of time with them like you do for a whole year. And that getting people to have the sense of, if I wanted to learn chemistry, I could learn chemistry, that's actually a good use of time. Then when they're in the classroom, they might have that sort of idea or that sense. So it just depends. I think programs that want to have a lot more direct outcome of something like, I'm going to study STEM, I think tend to be more often something like an after-school program, where it's in an out-of-school context, so they can use a lot of informal learning techniques and methods, but they have the kids for quite a long time, day after day, and they can really build on that knowledge. And so the other thing is, what outcome are you trying to have and what program is appropriate for it? For those particular outcomes, I would say this is not how I would probably design that project. I think Gary and then Steve.
Well, first, thank you for your presentation, Ray. It was terrific. I want to ask a basic question, and not being in this field,
probably something you can easily answer. But oftentimes, particularly developing a project, let's say, which has a STEM dimension, you'll be working with somebody and they'll say, oh, no, it's got to be STEAM.
Oh,
Or it has to be STQE, whatever. Is there, from my point of view, sure, why not? But are there any distinctions of importance between these things? Is there anything you've done that couldn't be done under the STEAM acronym?
In some ways I kind of want to answer the same way that I answered the other one, which is depending on what outcomes, for a creativity-focused project, 21st century skills and creativity, STEAM, sure, that's great, let's be broad. Or even relevance, I think STEAM is great for people who may feel like arts and design is a little bit more their thing. So I think the particular domain or the particular combination of domains, that can really vary. Just speaking to sort of why I focus on STEM, in my projects, it's partly, to be really candid, it's partly because the kinds of museums that do the kinds of learning I like, which is the really hands-on, kind of learner-centered, learner-driven learning, happens a lot in hands-on science centers or children's museums, and so it's the right kind of sort of setting for the kind of learning I like. Sure, let's learn about STEM, that's cool, but we could learn about something else. My PhD's in anthropology, we could talk about something else, and I'm open to it. Did that answer your question, or don't
Yeah, it's just, I'm surprised at the passion some people have, that they've got to have that A in there, or they've got to have that Q in there.
Yeah, they're totally welcome to have it if it's really key to what they're doing. I think, Steve, you had your hand up.
So I'm trying to figure out the right way to frame this. I think
it's going to be a mean
No.
question.
I don't think oh, I set the bar really low. Okay, so you brought up, very briefly, you said something about the kinds of facilitators who might come into the museums.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, maybe you have some volunteers and they're chemistry grad students or something like that. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit more about how or if you train the facilitators in a certain way, and especially because you also mentioned sort of studying the way that they facilitate as an outcome, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
And then maybe more specifically talk about, has there been any evidence of a bifurcation, when you think of the Frankenstein project, about looking at the facilitating the technical elements, but maybe not facilitating the more difficult social elements, or vice versa? I'm just curious.
So it's a really good question. I think both of these two projects, the way that the activities are being implemented typically, not exclusively, but typically, is by having a big event where all the activities are out and people kind of browse and go around to all of them. And so in that kind of a setting, having a variety of facilitators is good. And if this facilitator does focus a little more on the technical aspects and is a chemistry student, that's great. I met a real chemistry student. I can think about, would I want to be a chemistry student someday? But maybe that person doesn't focus as much on the societal stuff. Now I interact with a museum educator who's really excited about making connections to culture, and so sort of in the context of what somebody learns at the entire event, which is what this next round of evaluation is looking at, that kind of diversity is actually great, because you're not getting sort of one channel, and so we'll ask them, which of all these activities did you participate in? That's super messy too. And part of the, and the question about the training. So there are training materials. For the chemistry project in particular, there's kind of two kinds of training materials. The first kind is for event volunteers or regular museum staff, but whoever's going to show up and facilitate the activities. And that really focuses on, sometimes people call it just-in-time training, which I don't love, but, and that's sort of what do you need to know to be successful with this activity right now in the next hour, right? And sort of preparing people, what are the project goals, and let's try these out, let's talk through how we facilitate it. But it's really very focused on right now this activity, you're going to go do this. And that's what a lot of the participants will get, is a pretty rough one. My own observation, we did also prototype the training materials. My own observation is, a chemistry student gets better at facilitating as the day goes on. I had one student who kept asking a question in a way that kids weren't really getting what he meant. After a while, he figured out a better way to ask the question, and he asked it that way for the rest of the day. Some of it is, just like the public participants have to learn by actually doing it, so do the facilitators, honestly. Like, I can't talk to them for 5 years. They've got to actually kind of do it and learn it. And then there was a second kind of material we created, and that was more the research to practice kind of piece. And so that was sharing preliminary research findings. And the audience for that was not the person who's just going to show up and, they don't need to know, honestly, all the research that's embedded in the design of the activities. But that was for the museum, like the sort of key program manager or coordinator who is coordinating the event writ large. We want them to understand what we learned from the research so that they can apply that. They can, first of all, make sure that the event kind of embodies that learning, but also next time they do a different chemistry activity, they can sort of take those findings and maybe apply them. So that piece, because the framework is still being refined, that was kind of preliminary, and that'll be a bigger focus at the end of the project. We're actually applying for a supplementary funding, because it's not complicated enough to do more of the kind of research and practice stuff with the program managers. Was there any piece of that I missed? Did I get it? Okay. Yeah.
Right, first I want to acknowledge the wonderful presentation, and I want to ask about something that you show in the beginning about the needs network. You show a map, and my question came from an inference of your presentation, and in particular from that map that you show, because I have the impression that the two experiences you shared today are based in kids that are distributed mostly in centers, and I think, or the needs network help you with the network that you have for this place, or it's something similar. But I also think that most of the experience that you present or you work are focused in urban environments. And I think that, I don't know, I want to know more if some of these experiences are designed for rural environments or little environments, activity centers, or what happens there? Because I think that universities and infrastructure are uneven distributed, and museums in particular.
For sure.
How manage this cultural gap between rural and urban in informal STEM education?
This is an awesome question. I love this question. So the first thing about the map is you may have noticed was only the United States. And so our projects for the NISNet have been mostly federal sources of funding. And so we're limited to working within the United States. So that's just one first thing. But in terms of the distribution, we have worked super hard to get participating organizations all across the U.S. in all 50 states. And we've actually done a huge amount of work in trying to reach out to the rural communities, especially because of this need, right? Sure, need is great in urban communities, but there's also lots of resources and there's lots of opportunities, and you can seek them out. In a lot of rural communities, there really are a lot fewer resources and a lot fewer opportunities. There are many reasons, but one of the many reasons that we've partnered so much with children's museums is that a smaller community doesn't necessarily have a big fancy science museum. They're more likely to have a children's museum. And those children's museums are actually pretty excited about doing hands-on STEM, but their staff tend to come from an early childhood kind of learning background. And so these resources, they're super excited about because they're doable in their setting, and it allows them to do something that they wanted to do but haven't had the expertise themselves. In terms of how do we make them work for different kinds of institutions, right, and different staff with different expertise, but also different visitors with different backgrounds, we have this big process of stakeholders that we involve during development. And so everything that we develop gets reviewed by other educators, informal educators, and by subject matter experts. So if it's a chemistry project, it's chemists, whoever the subject matter expert is. If it's a science and society project, Dave will review it, whatever. And then we do evaluation with visitors, so we get this sort of public participation. And then the third and final sort of set of stakeholders, and sometimes it could be even more, right? We've got a partner in an organization, but the fourth kind of really key piece of information that we always get is from the organizations that implement them. And so we get a lot of feedback from all our partners, and we are very careful to be sure we get science museums, children's museums, cities, towns, different areas of the country. We get feedback on that. And this can happen at different stages, but we've really adjusted over the years what we've done by hearing from what works better for smaller communities with fewer educators. And so if we put together one of these kits with 8 activities, it always has a couple that work for really, really little kids. Even if you're a science museum, there's always really little kids. There's a whole like sort of matrix of criteria that try to make it maximally useful for the most institutions. Nothing's ever perfect for everybody, but like sort of to work the best that it can for the broadest public audiences and for the widest range of our partners. It's a great question. It's something that we really care about in the network and has really influenced a lot of the way we do projects. And one of our key things is we give our resources away for free. And that's super important to us because if we had any kind of a fee, even a sliding fee, any kind of a fee, that automatically means some of the communities that are most in need cannot possibly get the resources. And so that's been one reason for the federal funding, is that lets us give everything away for free and just not make that an issue.
Time for one more.
One more.
All right.
Brown.
I hope it's last question worthy. So, I'm Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan.
I'm looking for some girl to hold my football. If you don't get that, sorry. So HSD student, PhD, but really more safety director for Open Schools and Engineering. So I was dealing with lab safety. So I'm curious, so there's another direction I'm going to go. So, and if you already covered it, I apologize, I can't remember. So I'm curious what sort of things you might have either done or observed, et cetera, especially if you're doing any prospective sort of looking, sort of normalizing the wearing of personal protective equipment, getting them always thinking about risk and how to get changing risk by virtue of what they're doing, inculcating safe habits, the ability to ask questions, the sorts of things that we struggle with here and across all of academia and lab safety.
Yeah, so we're super into safety. Museums, our museum partners, all have their own, some kind of safety guidelines, some sort of safety committee and review. We have a safety review as part of that review. I was describing the sort of educator scientists, right? Safety is part of that. I'll just use the chemistry project as an example. So ACS is like hyper aware of safety, and they have a safety committee, and then they also within that committee have folks that work both on outreach and on elementary environments. And so those were the folks that worked with us because they sort of have an understanding of the kinds of activities we're doing. And so they were involved kind of at every stage, but even from the very beginning, it was sort of like which activities are within the realm of possibility. Some were not, and that's fine. And most museums, open flames, forget it, right? Like we're just not even going there. So there's already a filter from the very beginning. And then as we develop them, there's always this sort of process of safety review. We adjust the materials. We had, one of the activities uses dry ice, and we had endless discussions about what containers the dry ice could be in, right? That it would be safe. Because there's two things. You can tell people to be safe, but you can also design it so that they're not getting themselves in a position where they could be unsafe, right? And so we're trying to do both of those two things. We're trying to be explicit about safety. And so there's a separate safety guide, there's safety training as part of the facilitation training, there's sort of little signs, all the goggles come in the kit, there's lots of sort of redundant systems for people to get the safety methods, but then ultimately we try to make it so that people aren't getting themselves in a position where they could be doing something that's really unsafe. Children's museums have all sorts of choke hazard kind of guidelines, and so we always have to keep that in mind. There's just bunches of stuff.
Great, thank you so much, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.